Okay, today we're continuing to make our way through Chapter 20. We are on to Section 3, which is about the triangular trade system and the Atlantic slave trade. First of all, we'll talk a little bit about some of the causes that led to African slavery. Once the European nations like England, France, the Dutch, Portugal, Spain started to create strongholds in the Americas, they generally created plantations. The most popular at this time were sugar and tobacco plantations, and these plantations actually required a large amount of workers to become a lucrative investment. The Europeans first enslaved native peoples, but their population at the time was depleted due to disease, which killed about 90% of natives all over the Americas, warfare, fighting between European colonizers and native tribes, and then also brutal treatment. I mean, they were treated very poorly, and many of them died or committed suicide due to that. Around 1500, Europeans began to use African slaves that they traded for to work in their plantations in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and then eventually in the English colonies of North America. We'll talk a little bit about how slavery worked in Africa. Slavery had been present in Africa for a long time. It was really known as more of a minor institution that was based on tribal warfare. Same thing was going on in the Native American world as well. The Muslim occupation and spread into Africa, though, increased the use of slavery and the slave trade within Africa. Between 650 and 1600, Muslims had transported about 17 million Africans to the Muslim lands of North Africa and also into Southwest Asia. Muslims believed that they had the right to enslave, buy, and sell, and also trade non-Muslim prisoners of war. The thing about it is that this type of slavery was a little bit different than what we generally know as the American system. This actually allowed slaves a lot more freedom and social mobility, and in saying that they also had a chance due to good work and developing relationships with the slave masters to be freed. This did not happen very much in the American system, okay? So there's a major difference there. Letter C talks about the demand for Africans. The Portuguese were really the first Europeans to get involved with African slaves. They really started the slave trade. As Native Americans began to die off due to disease, the Europeans would turn to the Africans for several reasons that they explained. These are not my personal viewpoints, but many Africans had already been exposed to European diseases, and so therefore they had built up the natural immunities like the Europeans had. Native Americans, having a lack of prospects of domesticable species, did not have the chance to develop those immunities, and so they were dying off much more than African peoples were. The next part of this is that many African people at this time had experience with farming, whereas some native tribes in the Americas were still practicing hunting and gathering. So obviously, if you're doing sugar plantations and tobacco plantations, having experience with farming would be something that they would be looking for. And then this one I tend not to agree with too much, but what European slaveholders would say is that they thought Africans would be less likely to escape than a Native American slave because the Africans would be in a foreign land. I don't really know how much that is an issue there, but that is something that was stated in the historical documents and primary sources when looking into this topic. Now, the Atlantic slave trade basically was the buying and selling of Africans for the purpose of work in the Americas. It took place generally between 1500 and 1800. From 1500 to 1600, there were about 300,000 slaves transported to the Americas. From 1600 to 1700, that jumps to 1.3 million slaves. The slave trade actually ends around 1870, but by that point in time, 9.5 million slaves had been transported from the Africas to the Americas. Capital letter D, we're going to talk about Spain and Portugal and what their role is in this. Spain used African slaves mostly in gold and silver mines. Portugal actually, as I said earlier, started the slave trade, and they began to use slaves in Brazil on sugar plantations. More than 40% of all African slaves worked in Brazil for the Portuguese. Roman numeral number 2 talks about the spread of said slavery. England eventually became the European entity that began to transport more slaves toward the end. From 1690 to 1807, England had transported about 1.7 million slaves. Now, one thing that's controversial is African cooperation and resistance. Many African rulers and merchants played a willing role in the slave trade. What was happening is they would capture African peoples and transport them to ports where they would then be sold to Europeans in exchange for goods, which were mostly guns and gold. However, some rulers also began to resist this institution of slavery, and others continued to participate. So, this is something that's been going on for quite some time. And the implications of slavery, though, in the African system, as I explained earlier, were much different than the American system. Next is Roman numeral number 3. This was a forced journey. It was generally known historically as the triangular trade. It's the transatlantic trading network. And there were basically 2 triangular systems that are outlined here in your text on page 568. And one of the passageways was called the Middle Passage. This was the voyage that brought African slaves to the Americas. This was a very harsh journey, and actually 20% of African slaves died from various causes on their passageway or the Middle Passage or their journey to the Americas. So take a look at a couple of things here. First of all, this is the triangular trade system. You see a lot of lines going pretty much all throughout this triangular region here or this triangular region here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to simplify this. Okay, to simplify this, what I did is I drew sort of my own version of this and made it just a little bit more basic. So I used this symbol for the Americas. I didn't make it exactly what the Americas look like. I've used the rectangle for Europe and this blue triangle for Africa. What essentially was happening, if you break it down, guns and gold were being sent to Africa in exchange for slaves. Those slaves that were being bought by the Europeans through guns and gold were then sent to European colonies in the Americas where they would perform the work. Once the slaves were here, what they produced were raw materials, cotton, raw tobacco, anything that's not manufactured. It was sent to Europe, and in European factories, it was manufactured. Cotton turned into blankets, cotton turned into clothing, and then sent back to the Americas, where it was sold to the colonists. So who's really monopolizing this entire system? It's Europe. Because in the Americas, people who had plantations, they were producing raw materials, sending them over to Europe, but Europe is then sending the manufactured goods that these people also need, and they're going to buy. So the big benefactor here is Europe. Guns and gold that was introduced into Africa had a catastrophic impact. You take African tribes that have been fighting their style of warfare for thousands of years. Now you have tribe A that has guns, but tribe B that has primitive weapons. What happens in that now is tribe A entirely wipes out all of tribe B. And so European intervention in Africa really led to a shortage of civilized advancements due to the fact that the way that the Europeans would utilize African peoples was to their detriment. Okay, slavery in the Americas was, as I said earlier, extremely harsh. In the Americas, slaves were usually auctioned off to the highest bidder. They worked in mines or in fields as domestic servants. They would live on small portions of food and in small huts. Slavery was generally a lifelong condition and was hereditary. So you literally had people that owned other people that had been bought and sold. It's a really sad part of world history, but also of American history. You did have some resistance and rebellion, though. You did have slaves rebelling against their owners. Africans would cope with the harsh treatment by keeping alive many of their cultural traditions, such as music and stories. They would create resistance. They would break tools, destroy crops. They would work in a slow fashion. They had started to run away and escape. There were some open revolts. The first one took place in 1522 on the Spanish plantations. They also happened in Brazil, the West Indies, and North America. One famous slave rebellion in North America was called the Stono Rebellion, which took place in 1739 in the region of South Carolina. It was a fairly successful one. But what we'll take a look at here is Roman numeral 5, the consequences of the slave trade. In Africa, many families were torn apart. Usually these slave traders, what they were looking for are the strongest and most fit members of society. So they were usually taken away which left the tribal associations back in Africa without their greatest people. It introduced guns into the society through trade, and I sort of explained the catastrophic impact that had. In the Americas, you had an unwilling contribution to an economic boom in the American colonies through forced labor. But in the long run, slavery in the Americas did increase the population and created a cultural diversity with a mix of African culture. Okay. One thing I did want to show, just to show you how harsh the journey was when African peoples were sent across the Middle Passage, is the recollection of Olaide Equiano, who was an eyewitness to what was going on in these ships. And this is how the Europeans had designed the hull of the ships below the deck to pack in as many slaves as possible. You can see how tight and compacted this several month journey would have been for these people during this time period. Very sad.